Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from wherever you're joining us from today. My name's Sarah, and I'm the Program and Event Manager at the Reactor in Sydney, Australia. Welcome to another Microsoft Reactor Sydney live stream event and another episode of our Devs Down Under series. I would like to welcome Anthony Shaw tonight, who you'll see on screen here with his presentation. Anthony is a Python advocate for Sydney, Australia, running and contributing to several popular open source tools for DevOps, security, automation, and code quality. Anthony has been recognised for his contribution to open source, including as Fellow of the Python Software Foundation and member of the Apache Software Foundation. Tonight, he will be presenting on Visual Studio Code for Python developers. So you'll also see I've put into the comment section there a link to our check-in page with the event code. Please check in for tonight with the event code 14114 to get additional resources from the session this evening. It will be about 60 minutes that Anthony will be presenting, and with 10 minutes of those being for questions at the end. However, do send us your questions throughout in the Q&A and comment section, whether you're on YouTube Live or Learn TV, and we will try and answer as many as possible throughout if it's relevant to the topic or towards the end. And we will be sharing with you a link to our feedback survey, which will be with the same event code 14114. So if you have time to fill that out, that will be great. And this will go automatically to our YouTube channel after, so you can find that link in the check-in page. So if there's anything that you missed from today's session or would like to reference back again later on, you'll be able to view the on-demand version on our YouTube channel. However, without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Anthony to begin the session for tonight. So Anthony, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for coming along. This is great. I unfortunately can't be there in person this month. We're in lockdown in Sydney and in lots of places around the world. So hopefully everyone can see me. And yeah, we'll keep this nice and interactive as well. The plan today is to go through, and I wanted to show you Visual Studio Code, which is one of the new code editors that Microsoft is working on. It's available for free, so hopefully you've at least heard of VS Code. And what I want to do in this talk over the next hour is show you about some of the Python capabilities. So my expertise is in Python, and I work all day, all week in Python. So I wanted to show you kind of what VS Code can do when you're working with Python. And this is going to be, I guess, on the assumption that you already know how to write some Python code. So I'll show you some of the basics that the editor can do, and then I'll show you some of the more advanced functionality as well. But first things first, I guess you're going to need to download and install VS Code if you haven't done already. You can get it online at code.visualstudio.com. There's a build for Mac, Linux, and Windows. This is a standalone desktop application that you can install locally. So that's, I guess, step one. So luckily, I've already got mine installed. We don't need to wait for that. So this is my VS Code environment, and I'm going to really kind of spend the next hour talking through kind of how I've configured it and how I've set it up, and some tips and tricks that you can do when you're working with Python. So the first thing you'll need after you've installed VS Code is you'll need to install the extension. So if we go to the extensions view on the left, which you can also get to by going to View Extensions from the top menu. I'm on a Mac, so that's how my menu looks here, and the shortcuts are Mac shortcuts. For Windows, the shortcuts generally, if it's a command for Mac, then it's Control key for Windows. Most of the menus and stuff are identical with Windows, Linux, and Mac. And I won't go through things like keyboard shortcuts today because they depend on the operating system. So VS Code out of the box is a vanilla code editor. You can use it to edit any kind of rich text files or anything out of the box, whether that's JavaScript, Python, C, C++. However, all the powerful functionality comes from the extension. So you can edit Python files and Python scripts with VS Code without installing anything, but all of the good stuff comes with the extension. So once you're in the extensions panel, you need to search for Python, and then up the top, you'll get this Python extension here. You'll know it's the right one because it's got almost 40 million downloads now, which is phenomenal. And then once that comes up, there should be a button here to install that extension. That comes with everything you'll need for the demos that I'm going to be showing today. So that's the first things first. And then secondly, you're going to need to install Python. If you don't have a copy of Python installed on your machine already, probably the best place to get that from would be python.org. And on python.org, there's a download section. And in there, you can download the latest version for your operating system. 3.9 is the latest. Sometimes you might work with applications or code which needs an older version. So you'll see here active Python releases and the major versions which are still supported, which is 3.9, 3.8, 3.7, 3.6. 2.7 sometimes is required for older scripts and applications. That is end of life, but you can still download it via the site here. If you're on Windows, the easiest way to install Python is to type Python 3 at the terminal, and it will open up the Windows Store and prompt you to install it via the Windows Store. That's probably the easiest way to install Python on Windows. On Mac OS, I'd recommend doing it via the python.org site that gives you, I guess, the sort of the latest and greatest Python interpreter. So once you've done that, you're going to need to go ahead and create a new file. So I've been working on one here called hello.py. And in the editor, you can just write your Python code inline. And the editor will give you all sorts of information as you're writing Python code. So in my case, I've been working with just a simple list of names, Larry, Jim, and Julia. And if I hover over that list, it tells me that it's a list of strings. And then I can run functions. So I've made a mistake here on purpose to kind of show some of the capabilities with this editor. So this is a common beginner mistake, but when you want to sort a list, there are two ways of doing it. So one way is to use the sorted built-in, which you could give sorted names. That would return a list of sorted names. The other is to do names.sort. And that actually returns nothing because it does it in place. So what I was doing before was I was saying, if I'm doing ordered names is names.sort, it's actually going to tell me that that is nothing. It's a none variable. So this information is from an extension called Pylons, which comes with the Python extension. It's a new feature that the team have been working on over the last year or so. And it's something that I'll be covering in a bit more detail as we go through the session. So out of the box, the Python extension will give you all sorts of information, including things like type heads for module imports. So if you wanted to import from the standard library, for example, all of that information would be there by default. So if you wanted to use the regex module and maybe run regex compile, that information is going to be there out of the box. So it's kind of beyond, I guess, just a simple code editor. It's got a lot of knowledge about both the standard library modules and packages that you might want to use. So this is, I guess, a simple example. If you're working with your own code as well, then it's also going to give you type ahead information about any functions, modules, classes that you might be using. So if we wrote this simple function to check if a number is even, then it's going to give us the type ahead information from this as well. Something you can do in the newer version of the extension is you can annotate your functions with Python's type annotations. So in this case, we're expecting n to be an integer, and we're going to return a Boolean. So I can get that information now by hovering over the function, and it's going to tell me the type annotations and the type information. If I gave it a string, for example, instead, it's going to highlight that for me and tell me that that function is expecting a number, and I'm trying to give it a string. So this information comes from Pylons, and I'll show you in a second how you configure Pylons for more of the advanced features. So Pylons, I guess, is it's not really a linter. It kind of analyzes the code and gives you information, and it uses type annotations as its strength. It uses something called type shed. So the standard library modules, as well as type information for popular packages like NumPy and Pandas will all come with Pylons. If you're working with your own code and it is type annotated, either with the 3.8 style, or if you use quoted type annotations, then Pylons will still adhere to that information as well. So that's just I guess a basic of what can be done with the Python editor. Now, if you've just installed VS Code for the first time and you've previously been using a different editor, there's probably a few tweaks and changes you might want to make. So let me step you through some of those basics. So the first things first, you might want to change keyboard shortcuts. So all of the extensions come with a basic set of keyboard shortcuts, and the editor itself also comes with some default keyboard shortcuts. The way you access this is to go to Preferences and then go to Keyboard Shortcuts, and it's going to open up this keyboard shortcut window here. Another way to get to that is to use the command palette. I'll probably use the command palette quite a lot on this demo because it's kind of like a core feature of VS Code, and it's how you access most functionality in VS Code. So to get to the command palette, you can either run the shortcut, which on Mac is Command-Shift-P, and it will bring up this entry point here. So I could type in keyboard shortcut, and it could open the keyboard shortcut window for me. Pretty much everything you can do in VS Code is available by the command palette. The other way to access it is to do View and then Command Palette. That would again bring up the command palette window. All extensions will expose functionality via the command palette, and in some cases there is functionality that is available in VS Code that there's no GUI option for, like you can't find it via right-clicking or clicking around in the menus. It's only available via the command palette. So it is useful to, I guess, rely on the command palette more as you start to use VS Code and become more confident in VS Code. So getting back to the keyboard shortcuts. So like I mentioned, out of the box, VS Code will have assigned some basic keyboard shortcuts for you. Some extensions will also assign their own. If you're coming from another editor and you're used to a certain set of keyboard shortcuts, there's a little trick I'll show you, which is you can go to the extensions view again. So go to extensions, click on filter at the top, go to category, and then go to key maps. And it will actually give you a list of extensions that people have made, which have basically bundled in the key bindings for any popular editor. So if you've come from Atom, for example, or Vim or Notepad++, and you've kind of memorized all those keyboard shortcuts, then you can install that keyboard map basically, and it will override all these settings for you. So all the defaults you'd expect if you were from the editor would then be applied. So that's a little trick just out of the box. Also, you can basically come in here and assign or reassign any keyboard bindings. So if you see a command that you wanted to change, you can right click on that and do change key binding. Something else you can do, which not many people know about, which is you can search for commands at the top. Lots of commands in extensions don't have keyboard bindings. So for example, I've got one here, which is create terminal that I've created myself. So if I want to create a Python terminal at any point, then I can just press Command T. You can assign these special expressions, which basically just make sure that that keyboard binding only works under certain circumstances. So for example, this one only applies if I'm working with a Python file. So, if I'm in a JSON file or Markdown or something and I press that shortcut, that's not going to work because it's only restricted to when the editor is working with Python. So you can basically work in here and assign any additional keyboard shortcuts. Something else you can do is if you find yourself running a particular command quite often from the command palette, for example, I use the SQLite extension quite often, then you can click on the cog here and it will take you straight to the editor and you can assign a key binding from the command palette. So if you're finding that you run commands often, then I definitely recommend assigning a key binding. So Okay, cool. So the next thing we can look at is on the left-hand side. This menu on the left-hand side is called, this is the activity bar. So another trick you can learn with VS Code is that when you install by default, you probably got to think about 4 or 5 items on the left-hand side. You can configure which ones are shown by right-clicking on this bar and then basically toggling any of these additional ones. Most of these come from extensions. If you prefer it on the right as well, you can switch it onto the right-hand side. But most functionality would be available from the activity bar. So the default modes would be the Explorer view, the source control view, and the search view. I've also got some extras. I use Test Explorer, which I'll show you later. And I also use some additional ones like Thunder and Remote Explorer, which again, I'll show you later on. So that's kind of the activity bar. If there are any subpanels that you use quite often, so for example, if you use the outline view often, you can actually drag that to the left-hand side and it becomes a permanent fixture on your activity bar. So if you use outline often and you just want to have it there permanently, you can just drag it across. So we can, and then if you're change your mind, you can go and drag it back. So actually not many people know that you can do that. That's quite a cool feature. So another thing you can do when you're working in VS Code is you can split panels. So if you click once on a file, it will just open it in preview mode. You'll know that it's in preview mode because the file name will be in italics. If you double click on the file name, it'll be open permanently. So if you wanted to switch files, for example, it's just going to show those in preview mode. If you wanted to keep that open permanently, again, you double click on that. Something else you can do is you can split the screen left to right, up and down. This is a feature you'd expect in pretty much any code editor. The shortcut for Windows is Control / and for Mac it's Command /. So split right is probably a keyboard shortcut you're going to use quite often, especially if you have a massive widescreen monitor. You can go crazy with that sort of thing, and you can split screens up, down, left, right, multiple panels, and have as many files as you like open at any one time. Something else you can do in VS Code is there is something called Zen Mode. If you go to View, Appearance, and Zen Mode, it will basically show your editor with 0 distractions. I've never used this. I probably should, to be honest, because I get distracted quite easily, but it is a simple and handy feature. So let me have a look through my list of stuff that I wanted to show you this evening. So you may have noticed in my editor, I've got, it kind of looks a little bit different to the defaults. So let me show you, for example, in here, I'm working with an array. If I was working with something that was a bit more nested, let's have a look. Okay, so this line here. So on this line, I've installed a handy extension called Rainbow Brackets. All the extensions that I show you or mention in this talk are available from the extensions panel. So if you search for Rainbow Brackets, this one here, then it basically just makes a small change to the editor, which means that all parentheses, square brackets, curly braces will be color-coded based on their depth. So in here, for example, I've got sort of a nested list, and you can see that the outer square bracket is blue and the inner one is purple. That's a pretty handy feature. In terms of the other customizations that I have on the look and feel of this, they're already themes. So in my case, I'm using a extension called Material, which is all under the themes category when you go in the extension tab. And if you search for Material, you'll find the Material extension. So that comes with color themes as well as icon themes. There's thousands of different themes. I'm not going to go into too much depth about theming because it's probably a bit off topic. But this one that I'm showing you now is called Pale Night. So again, if you go to the command palette, look for color theme, you can switch themes easily in here. So I'm using Material theme Pale Night which I quite like. But again, you can switch through any of those until you find something that you like the look of and you're happy working in. So let's put it back. Something else you probably want to do as well is to change the default font. I recommend going to a site called programmingfonts.org. And on programmingfonts.org, you can browse and download a few hundred actually different monospace fonts, which are designed for programming. So in this site here, you can have a flick through and see which one you like the look of, which one you find easy to read, and then just download that and configure it. So all of the configuration for VS Code is done either through the configuration interface, which you get to by going to settings. And in the configuration interface, it's grouped by user and workspace. So you can basically assign global settings at the user level and then override those at a workspace level. So in my case, I've got a number of settings I've applied globally across any project that I work on. For example, I work with the Meslo font interface, so I've assigned that in here. The other way of working with settings is to go to the command palette and look for preferences, open settings, brackets, JSON. That will basically open up all your settings, but in its raw format, which is a JSON file. This is probably easier if you're copying and pasting settings from other people, or if you want to review how things are configured. I'll refer back to this a bit because I think when you get into some of the more advanced features, it's handy to know which specific settings you might want to override or configure. So I'll refer back into that. But that JSON file is something that you can override at a project level, and I have done in this particular project, which I'll show you in a second. So for Python in particular, there are some settings which I think are important for you to have configured, and you would find those by searching for Python. And then here in the extensions, you'll get Python under extensions. You can configure anything in the Python extension in here. I will be covering some of the key points, I guess, some of the key settings that you'll need to look for throughout this talk. So I guess moving beyond the absolute basics, I'll cover off things that you'll need to do with Python other than just editing Python files, because that's one step. Second step is how do you actually run the file? So if you've installed Python, best practice is that you would create a virtual environment for each Python project that you would run. And the way that you create virtual environments normally is to open up a terminal. So let me show you how we can do that in VS Code. So VS Code has got an integrated terminal. So from the menu at the top, you can pick terminal and then new terminal. And it's going to open up a new terminal. Mine has activated my virtual environment automatically because I've already got one configured. But if you're starting from scratch, normally you would create a virtual environment using a module like venv by running python-mvenv and then creating a virtual environment locally. So once you've done that and you've created a virtual environment, you would click on either this shortcut here, which is the Python interpreter selector, or you would go to the command palette and go to Python select interpreter. This basically is a set of options to pick which Python interpreter you would use for this folder. So in the workspace that you're working, which Python interpreter should it be using? My local machine's quite unusual because I have a ridiculous number of Python versions installed, but such is my job, so that's kind of required. But normally you'd have any major versions you have in here, as well as any virtual environments that it has discovered. If you've just created one, it would normally pop up in the corner and say it's detected that you've just created one. Do you want to use that as a default interpreter? If you've done that ahead of time, you should find it in this list. So the list is prioritized by user virtual environments. And then as you scroll down, these are the system versions of Python. So if you just wanted to use the built-in system Python 3.9, you could pick that from the list. Once you've selected the interpreter, all of the information you get in the editor, as well as running any Python code, is done with that interpreter. So if I work with this file here, hello.py, and I click on play, it's going to go and run that file. And I already know the error because Pylons told me, but you can't do a modulus of a string. So it's going to raise a type error. So let me change that to 4, and we can see something a bit more useful. So it's going to run that file for me using the interpreter that was configured. So that's the basic way to run a Python file, using this play icon up the top. That basically just runs it in the terminal. It doesn't do anything fancy. It also doesn't invoke any of the debugger or anything like that. So this is just if you're opening a script and you just want to quickly run it, that's the quickest and easiest way to do so. So I was going to show you. In terms of the terminal, so when I open this up, it brought me to a Python shell. You can, in the new, this has just changed in the newest version of VS Code, but you can have multiple terminals open at once. And you can go here to the plus icon and pick from any of these. I'll show you a little trick to configure that differently, because I'm about the way I like this done. So if you're in settings, in the Json version of the settings, you can configure something called integrated profiles for terminal. And I can share a link afterwards for some examples. Actually, I'll probably just share my whole settings with everybody if you want to borrow any of the things that I've shown. So in integrated profiles, you can specify which terminals you want to have available for you quickly. So in my case, I've got PowerShell, Z Shell, which is a sort of shell for Mac. And also I've got the Python 3 REPL, which is super handy. So if I go here and I go to Python 3 REPL, it will take me straight into the Python REPL. So that will use the local interpreter. If you wanted to give it any extra arguments or anything like that, you can provide those just in this configuration file. So if you find that the options here are not what you'd prefer, then you can override all of that in the settings file. Okay, so the other things you might need is when you're working with Python is a linter and a formatter. So out of the box, the Python extension works with a number of different linters. And the way that you would configure those is to go to the command palette and do Python select linter. And you can pick from any of the ones which are built in. In my project, I've configured Bandit as a linter, as a formatter, really. But you can also enable things like Pylint or MyPy if you want more type information. If you do so, then you need to have those installed. So I guess my recommendation is when you create virtual environments, you probably don't want to have to install all the basic tools like linters and formatters every time. So it's actually easier to have just a global setting where you've got a global version of some tools. So for example, I've got Poetry, which I use quite a lot, and also pipenv. If you wanted to have a global version of Black, for example, as a formatter, you can configure that by optioning for formatting.blackpath, and then basically giving it the path to Black. When you're configuring these things, you might need to put in some variables. For example, I know this lives within my home directory, so I can refer to it that way. So if you have used VS Code before and you find it annoying that it always asks you to install Black or Pylint or something, my recommendation is to have a global setting with a path to that tool, and then it's always available and always there if you should need it. So if you have used Black before as a formatter, so normally the way you would run Black is you'd run on the terminal. Because VS Code and the Python extension has support for this built in, you can either format the document by going to Format Document from the command palette, or you can set a setting to automatically run any code formatters. So the way that you would do that in this example is we would create an override setting. So if you wanted to have settings which apply to every different project that you work with, then you would put them in the place that I showed you before. If you want a setting that only applies to this particular project, then that's a workspace setting. And that lives within a subfolder called .vscode. So in my example, I've created a .vscode folder, which you would just create by going to new folder. There's nothing special about that. And then creating a file called settings.json, and then just applying any additional settings that you want to override, which may be specific to this particular project. So in my case, I wanted black to be available, and I also want to run black every time I save a file. So for example, if I make a right mess of this file, then when I save it, it's going to run black again and format that for me automatically. So if you do want black to run automatically, or Pylons or any other tool, you can override that. But I recommend doing that at a workspace level, because sometimes you might work on other people's code and you don't want to have to go in and have to undo all your changes because you've automatically reformatted their entire code. Something else you can do automatically is you can run organize imports. So if, for example, I'm going to use some standard library modules like import JSON, and maybe let's NumPy, because I know that I have that installed. You might see just quickly that it organized those alphabetically for me. So you can enable that by setting code actions on save to organize imports with true. And then that would apply that in the project. You might see in some examples people not checking settings.json into Git. Actually, in some cases, I recommend doing that, because if you want everybody to be consistent in terms of organizing imports and running the formatter and stuff, and none of this is specific to you, then you can check in your VS Code directory into the Git project if you want to share that with some of your colleagues. It is also pretty helpful if some of the settings you have in here, which I'll show you, such as launch and tasks, and the test configuration have already been set up, so that when other people who are using VS Code come in, they don't need to reconfigure those things themselves. I did show you when we were working with this simple demo how Pylons can give you some information about the types being used in your Python files. If you're working with any data science libraries, for example, I've been working with a simple data set, which is to do with water quality in a lake in New South Wales, but it's just a simple demo. It does pull in information around data frames for pandas, as well as it understands type information for matplotlib, as well as NumPy and D arrays. So if you are working in the data science space, you might find that Pylons gives you some additional information. Cool. So now that I've shown that, I'll show you some testing functionality. So if you have tests in your project, the VS Code extension for Python supports unit test and PyTest and nose out of the box. I know that nose support is being dropped, and nose is not really that widely used anymore. Most people are using either unit test or PyTest. So in my simple project, I've created a test file here called test demo, and I've written two simple tests. One to check the variance function in statistics, and one to check the mean function. One of them is right and one of them is wrong. So if you do have either a tests folder or a subdirectory, or there's a place within your project where you do have tests already and you normally use PyTest, then the way to get testing configured in the Python extension, or the easiest way really, is to look for tests and then go down to Python configure tests. And it's going to ask you which framework you're using and then which folder they're in, and it will apply the settings for you. So I've already done this for mine. but you could say pytest and the root directory, and it will apply those settings automatically. Once it's done that, it's going to attempt to discover the tests, and then it's going to have some information about which tests are available. Once you've done that, you can run the tests again from the command palette by doing Python run all tests. And at the bottom, you'll see the information here with when it's running and then what the test results are. If you click on that, you can go to either view test output, which will give you the raw output, or if you're in the test file itself, you'll get some additional information. I've got some extra things in my view because I've got a couple of extra extensions installed, which I'll show you. One is the Test Explorer UI. I recommend you install this one because it adds this extra sidebar, which I'll show you in a second. So Test Explorer UI is the extension you want to install. And once you've done that, you can enable that by right-clicking on the activity bar and making sure testing is selected. And then you actually get this nice menu here where you get all your test modules, and then you can run all the tests by clicking on that double arrow, or you can debug a test, or you can redo discovery, for example. So in my example here, I've got my test demo file, and I know that I've got one pass and one failure. If I click on that test case, the test mean case, I can see it's been underlined in red. And if I hover over that, the Python extension will tell me that's because it was expecting 4, but the actual result was 3. Because the mean of those numbers is 3, it's not 4. So it's my fault, I made a mistake, but it tells me what the information is there. If you want to run that individual test again, you can just click run test and it'll run it again. So if we fix that test, run it again, that test should have passed now. Did I save the file? Okay, now it's passing. So yeah, that would run the test case again. Cool. So that would work for both unit test and PyTest. And here you can see there's both run and debug. So the other thing that's built into the extension is the debugger. So let me show you just with the demo file first, as that one's probably a little bit easier to see. So the way to use the debugger is you can apply breakpoints by clicking in the gutter here. So if we set a breakpoint here on this particular line, something important to note, that icon up here to run the file does not invoke the debugger. So if you've tried to use the debugger in the past and you've clicked that and it hasn't worked, that is why. Instead, you need to go to the run and debug icon, and I've actually got one here configured already. So let me already configured mine. So I did it ahead of time. I probably shouldn't have done that. So probably the easiest way to do this is to use a launch.json file. If I'm just going to delete that so that I can show you how it's supposed to look on the first go. If we go to hello.py, that's the one I wanted, and you go to the run and debug, you should just get a button here that says run and debug. Click on that button and you can either pick Python file or module. Because I'm just looking at an individual file here, I can click on Python file and it will just run that file with the debugger. So once it hits my breakpoint, it's highlighted the line. And then as with any debugger, you'd expect, just basic functionality, like you can look at Python variables. You can also set watches, for example, on variables. So if you wanted to set a watch on names, for example, you can do that using the watch list. You can also look at the Python call stack, and you can apply any additional breakpoints or anything like that ahead of time. So something else with the debugger, which is quite handy, is that you can, the watches are expressions. So you don't just have to type variable names. you can actually write any Python expression. For example, if you wanted to know the length of the names variable, you can just type any basic Python expression into that watch list. Once you're in the debugger, you can step in, step out, and continue as you'd expect. I guess with any pretty much any debugger that you might have used should have the same functionality. So that is the Python debugger. Now you might find it a bit annoying to have to go to run and debug and then pick the file every time. So I guess the way to make that permanent is that you would create a launch.json file, which is what I had before I deleted it. So let me just undo that. Launch.json is a config file inside your workspace, which tells VS Code which files or modules you want to run under the debugger. So in my case, I wanted to run water.py, which is one of the scripts I was working on. This information can come if you just do add configuration, and it'll take you through a wizard here. So there's actually a Python wizard, and it will help you fill in that information. So it might look like a lot of settings to get started with, but actually the wizard will help you with that. So all you need to tell it is which file do you want to run, and you can override any additional things like what command line arguments do you want to set. If you need to set environment variables, for example, then you can set those in the env setting. So pretty much anything you would do on the terminal, you can configure in launch.json. Once you've done that, you can give it a name, and you can have any number of these. If you've got multiple modules or scripts or whatever you want to test, you can have those in this launch.json file. Once you've done that, when you go back to the run and debug window, you'll actually see a drop down instead of that big button. And the one that you had there, the Python, in my case, I called it Python water analysis, which is this file. Let me just stick a breakpoint in so I can check it's working. Then I can run that by clicking on this icon instead. So that's how you want to debug all your scripts and files in the future, is to have them configured in a launch.json file, and then jump into this menu and click on that icon. So if I inspect any information or continue, then it's going to continue with my code. So that's how that works. That's how the debugger works. It's a really powerful feature, and it works across scripts, modules, virtual environments. All of that should be configured. I guess the most important steps with the Python extension are that you make sure you tell it which Python interpreter your project is using. Otherwise, a lot of this functionality is not going to work, because it's going to try and use your system Python, which in most environments, in most systems, doesn't have the right packages installed and things like that. So if you are using virtual environments, make sure you've configured the virtual environment by selecting the interpreter and got that applied. The next thing I wanted to show you in this whistle stop tool, this extension, is the Jupyter Notebook support. So if you are working with Jupyter Notebooks, then with the Python extension, you get Jupyter Notebook integration into VS Code out of the box. And I'll show you a couple of cool features that you wouldn't get if you were just using like an online Jupyter Notebook in the browser. So this basically merges the Python experience you get with the editor. So all that information you get from Pylons, as well as type aheads and linting and formatting and all that cool stuff. You get that in the Jupyter Notebooks editor as well. So, in this, for example, I can look at reCSV function. I know that PD is a module. I know that DF is a data frame. So all that information you get in the editor, you also get within Jupyter Notebooks. You can also do a few additional things. For example, if you're working with pandas or NumPy, either with data frames or ND arrays, then there is basically a built-in data viewer for those. So in this case, I'm reading in this CSV file, and it's going to preview that information for me in this data viewer, which is pretty handy. You'll also find this extra tab at the bottom with Jupyter variables. So if I run run this worksheet again, it's going to pull in any variables that were in that Jupyter Notebook. For example, it knows that I was working with this data frame, and it's going to give you an icon here to pop out on a whole tab just to explore that data frame in an additional tab. That's called the data viewer, and it's a great way of working with large data sets. Something else you can do in the extension, which you can't do in the Jupyter sort of the online versions, is you can install, actually you can do this in the online versions, but it's a handy feature anyway, is install matplotlib widgets. So once you've done that, then you'll get more interactive matplotlib graphs. So you can zoom in, zoom out, you can look at particular data points and get the coordinates, or you can export those directly from the editor. When you're working with Jupyter environments, there's a couple of things you need to configure. One is as with any Jupyter notebook, you need to set the correct kernel, which you do through this icon here. And you also need to make sure that you set the interpreter, which I've already done. So the Python extension supports Anaconda. So you can use Conda environments, Poetry, pip environments, pipenv environments, and there's another one that I can't forget. So yeah, basically any virtual environment you want to use. But Condas, I guess, Conda and pip are the two most important ones really in data science. So in my example, I'm using Anaconda, and I have a Conda environment already configured. And if I want to work with my data frame, then it's going to give me all the information I would need to work with my pandas data frame, as well as pop-ups to help you with things like how on earth do you slice an index, and things that, yeah, if you work with pandas a lot, you would probably, hopefully, remember, but maybe you forget them as much as I do. So all that information will come out of the box, which is nice and handy. So whilst we've got a couple of minutes left, there's a couple of bonus extensions I wanted to share with you. So these don't come with the Python extension, but they're just handy things to have anyway. One of those is called Rainbow CSV. This is particularly handy if you're working with, I've already got it installed, so let me just show you. If you're working with CSV files, it makes them nice and pretty by color coding them. That's one feature, which makes it easier to look at CSV files, but that's not the main reason I'm showing you. If you go to the command palette and type in rbql, you can actually run queries on the CSV file, which is really cool. So you can do kind of this like mini SQL syntax called rbql, and you can filter and work with CSV files. So if you're just exploring data and you need to visualize it, that's a great extension. You can also do things like align, realign the columns, and like manipulate rows and stuff like that. So if you're working with a lot of CSV files, I recommend the Rainbow CSV extension. Another extension I recommend is called Thunder Client, which is an exciting name. Thunder Client is a, if you've used Postman before, it is very similar to that. So you can create HTTP requests inside VS Code. So if you're working with Flask or Django REST framework or Fast API, then you can basically create any HTTP requests inside VS Code, get and post, work with JSON, and you can basically try anything you like. Anything you could do in Postman, you can do in Thunder Client. That's a really cool extension. You've also got the Docker extension, which I probably have hidden at the moment, but it's there somewhere. So in the Docker extension, you can manage your containers and images, especially if you're working with any sort of complex Docker environments. Something else which is handy is the code spell checker, which I probably had turned off because I make a lot of spelling mistakes. But if you were working in your code, and then you made a spelling mistake, it's going to highlight that for you. So this uses cspell, and it does actually, if you can never remember how to spell necessary, if you're like me, then it's going to give you some suggestions and fix that for you. It also does it for things like variable names, code comments. It's super handy, so I recommend the Codespell extension. And then the last one would be obviously the one that I made, which is VS Codepets, which is definitely not helpful, but it adds pets in your editor. And you can add cats, dogs, crabs, anything, and they'll wander around in the corner and make friends with each other, and you can throw a ball and other really silly things. So yeah, that's everything I wanted to show you today. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the things you can do with the extension, and I guess what VS Code is capable of. So we've got 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to need to probably stop sharing my screen and then switch back to the other menu. So hold on a second. Cool. So if anyone has any questions, then we just type them in the comments tab. Let me have a look through and see what people have asked.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, I've put them in there. A couple of came through Learn TV, so they're just under the Microsoft Reactor.
Okay.
That first one up the top there is, hi, Anthony, if you wanted to follow on from that.
So can you tell us how we can mount or connect Google Drive to import files in VS Code to perform data analysis during data science's job? Currently, I'm using another code editor for this work. Thank you. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. Google Drive. So if you're there are some Python extensions that would pull into, so I'd probably use a Python package to do that rather than a code extension. There probably is an extension that would connect into Google Drive. I haven't looked, but I know previously when I've worked with Jupyter Notebooks, which have data sources which are remote, then I've done everything in Python and not in the editor. So in Jupyter Notebook, I've used like something to pull in stream the data inbound and then plug it into pandas. That's probably what I'd suggest. But I will have a look in a second to see if there is any extensions maybe that could do that for you. Is it possible to remove or reduce the blue graphics on the top left and the bottom right? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was just our banner at the bottom there. Sorry about that to that person tuning in. Apologies. We'll remember to move that one next time.
Okay, sorry. Is there a GitHub repo shared? Yes, I'll share a link to some of the examples I've shown, as well as some of the sessions. Do you need a linter when using Pylons? That's one of the questions. So there are pros and cons. The short answer is no, you don't need a linter, but there are pros and cons to having a linter as well as Pylons. So for example, if you used Pylint or Flake 8, then it would pick up on some code style type issues that Pylons wouldn't pick up on. So Pylons wouldn't tell you anything kind of code style related. That's not what it's focused on. Pylons is more about the interfaces and types that are being used in the application. So you can definitely enhance your linting by doing that. I did share, I guess when you did select linter from the command palette, you don't have to pick one. You can pick as many as you like. The way to do that is to do that via settings. So if you just open up settings and type in Pylint or Bandit or whatever, then it'll pop up automatically with all the information. But you can just basically have that enabled for as many of the linters as you like, and they'll be run automatically as you're working in your code base.
Great, and I think the last one there was our survey link, which I've added in for everyone. We'll just give another minute for any questions to come through. In the meantime, I'll just remind everyone to please check in for today's session with the code 14114, and you can also use that one for the survey. We will share with you the links after, so please get in touch with us on our meetup pages, and we can personally email these ones to you if Anthony has any additional links that he'll be sharing. Well, I did just see another question come through from Learn TV. It says, could you please show us how to push code or commit changes for VS Code to GitHub?
Yeah, I can do that quickly. Yep. Let me just share my whole screen again. Yep. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of doing this. Let me show you the easiest way. So you should already have the source control icon on the left-hand side. If you don't, right-click on the activity bar and make sure that it's selected. Once you click on that, it's going to have initialize repository, and also there's a new feature in VS Code which is published to GitHub. This is the easiest way to do this now. So if you click on publish to GitHub, then you give your repository a name. If you've never used this before, it's going to ask you to log into GitHub. So you'll need to do that first so that you've got permission. So I'm going to publish to a public repository and call that VS Code session and make that public. And then you can pick which files you want to include. So in my case, everything apart from my PyCache and my PyTest cache will be fine. So let's send that up there. And it's going to publish that for me. And then it will give you this button at the end, open on GitHub, and it will open up GitHub and take you straight to that project. So that also saves me having to do that after the session, and I can now paste that in the in the chat window. So thanks for that question. Yeah, that's the easiest way to push things to GitHub. In terms of making changes to files, let's say I with my hello, I had a whole bunch of imports that I wasn't actually using. So let's delete those. And you'll see that this icon changes. So there's a number 1 there now, because that means there's one change. So the way to make changes to Git is to first stage them by clicking on this plus here. If you want to stage all files, you click on that icon. If you just want to stage that individual file, you click on just that file. Type in your message. I removed unused imports. And then on this tick icon, which is a commit, and then this will do a push and a pull. So you click on that one and it will push the changes up into the repository. So that is how you make changes in Git. You can also do more advanced things. If you're working in GitHub quite a lot, there's also a Github extension, which I already have installed. And inside there, if you're working in a Git project, which this is already linked to a GitHub project, then you can see all the issues in there. You can manage pull requests. You can open pull requests as well by just double clicking on them. It's really, really quite a cool extension. So I recommend the GitHub extension.
Great. I think we have time for just one more quick question. If you're able to answer that one, we've got one from Arthur. Sorry, the one he says, sorry if I missed it.
Okay, so where do you normally search to find all the possible configurations of tools like Black, iSort for VS Code? The settings.json config, and does it pick up your pyproject.toml configuration automatically? Okay, so if you create a settings.json file inside the .vs code folder, you can either just start off by typing Python dot. Every setting is under Python dot. So you Python dot, and then it will give you a type ahead. The other option is to open up the settings interface, which I kind of showed at the beginning, which is preferences settings, and then just searching for Python, and it will let you only show Python extension related settings, of which there are 109. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of things you can tweak, but most of the important ones I've shown you in the session. Related to pyproject.toml, no, it would not pick that up. So if you overrode black line length, for example, it wouldn't pick that up for you. But it would apply that anyway with black and ISOR and flake8. So I can't think of any settings where it would conflict with pyproject.toml, but that it doesn't read that file. It doesn't load that for you.
Great, thanks, Anthony. That's all we have time for today with the rest of the questions. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your afternoon and evening. And thank you to Anthony. We look forward to having you back again for another Microsoft Reactor live stream event. So thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks, everyone.